December air cuts hard across eastern Afghanistan. The mountains are black silhouettes against the paling sky. Below them, a Soviet helicopter drops altitude, rotors thundering as it slips into a familiar valley corridor, one flown hundreds of times before. Inside the cockpit, nothing feels unusual. The route is routine, the war endless. On the ground, among broken rock and frozen scrub, a small shape shifts. Not a cannon, not a radar dish, just a narrow tube lifted onto a shoulder. For months, Soviet pilots had been warned about heavy machine guns and aging missiles. Dangerous, but predictable. This looks like nothing, something almost disposable. Then a tone cuts through the noise. A sharp, electronic certainty. The launch is violent and brief. A flash. A streak of white fire racing upward faster than instinct can react. Seconds later, the sky ruptures. Metal fragments scatter. Fuel ignites. The helicopter vanishes into smoke and falling debris before the echo reaches the valley walls. Men on both sides freeze. Not in celebration, not in fear, but in realization. Because in that moment, something small has just rewritten the rules of the war. And to understand how it reached this valley, the story has to begin years earlier. Long before this missile ever crossed the border. The war that brought the Soviet helicopter into that valley did not begin as a war of ambushes and missiles. It began as a calculation. In December 1979, Soviet airborne units crossed the Amu Darya River under cover of darkness and winter fog. The official language spoke of international assistance. The real objective was control of Kabul, of the Afghan state, of a fragile political experiment that Moscow believed was slipping out of its grasp. Afghanistan, at that moment, was not yet a battlefield shaped by guerrilla mastery. It was a country fractured by coups, purges, an ideology imposed faster than society could absorb it. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan ruled in name, but not in reach. Tribal structures remained intact. Religious authority remained powerful. Geography remained unforgiving. The Soviet Union did not invade expecting a decade-long war. It expected stabilization. The plan relied on speed. Remove unreliable leadership. Secure major cities. Protect key roads and airfields. Let Afghan government forces handle the rest. For the first months, that logic appeared sound. Kabul fell under firm control. Major garrisons were established. Soviet mechanized columns pushed along highways linking cities that had rarely been governed from the center even in peacetime. But Afghanistan was not a country that surrendered between cities. Beyond paved roads lay valleys where vehicles could not maneuver. Beyond airfields lay mountains where maps lost meaning. Every supply convoy stretched into vulnerability. Every outpost depended on a single road or a helicopter. By 1981, the war had changed shape. The enemy was no longer concentrated. There were no front lines. There was no decisive battle to be fought. Instead, there were valleys that erupted at night and went silent by morning. Fighters who blended into villages. Supply routes that functioned one day and disappeared the next. The Mujahideen did not need to defeat Soviet forces outright. They needed to exhaust them. This is where Soviet air power became central. Helicopters were no longer support assets. They were lifelines. The Mi-8 carried troops, ammunition, food, and the wounded. It inserted platoons onto ridgelines no road could reach. It evacuated isolated units before they were overrun. It connected a scattered war into something manageable. The Mi-24 gunship followed close behind. Heavy, fast, and terrifying when first introduced, it combined troop transport with overwhelming firepower. Rockets, cannons, machine guns, everything needed to dominate ground fighters who had little more than rifles and courage. From the air, Soviet commanders could bypass terrain instead of conquering it. For several years, this advantage held. The Mujahideen learned quickly, but their tools were limited. Heavy machine guns could be deadly, but only when helicopters flew low and slow. Older surface-to-air missiles existed, but they were scarce, unreliable, and difficult to employ. Hits happened, but losses remained within what Moscow considered acceptable. The skies were dangerous, but not denied. As a result, Soviet doctrine adapted around vertical mobility. Operations were planned assuming helicopter insertion. Patrols assumed air resupply. Casualty evacuation depended on rotor blades cutting through thin mountain air. Every system leaned upward. By the mid-1980s, however, the strategic environment beyond Afghanistan had shifted. This was no longer just a regional intervention. It was a front in a global contest. Across the border in Pakistan, refugee camps swelled into cities. Training camps multiplied. Funding increased. Weapons improved, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady increments that reflected a growing commitment by external actors to keep the war alive. The logic was simple. If the Soviet Union could not be beaten conventionally, it could be bled. Each helicopter shot down meant trained crews lost. Each disrupted resupply meant units tied to ground they could not hold alone. Each delayed rotation meant morale eroded another degree. The Mujahideen did not need tanks, they needed leverage. By 1985, Soviet commanders on the ground could feel the pressure building, even before the weapon that would symbolize it arrived. Helicopter crews adjusted routes. Flares were used more frequently. Flight profiles changed. Losses, though still manageable, were no longer abstract. Still, the sky remained open. Soviet pilots continued to fly low through valleys because accuracy demanded it. High-altitude strikes missed targets hidden in folds of rock and forest. Ground forces depended on precision, not saturation. This dependence created a vulnerability that was structural, not tactical. It meant that if the airspace itself ever became truly hostile, if a weapon existed that was portable, reliable, and fast enough to punish even brief exposure, then the entire operational balance would tilt. Not overnight, not everywhere at once, but decisively. By late 1986, such a weapon was moving toward the Afghan battlefield, carried not in convoys or aircraft, but by individuals, one tube at a time. And when it appeared, it did not announce itself with fanfare. It simply waited for a helicopter to do what it had always done before. Which brings us to the moment when outside decisions, covert pipelines, and Cold War calculations finally intersected with that narrow mountain corridor. By the time the new weapon reached Afghanistan, the decision to change the air war had already been argued in rooms far from the mountains. In Washington, the Soviet presence was no longer seen as a temporary miscalculation. It was viewed as an opportunity, one that mirrored the long American experience in Vietnam. The objective was not victory in the conventional sense. It was cost. Every year the war continued, it consumed Soviet resources, political credibility, and manpower. Every escalation risked international backlash, but inaction risked normalization. The war had to remain expensive. The program designed to apply that pressure operated quietly. Weapons did not move directly from one superpower to another battlefield. They passed through layers, through Pakistan, through intelligence services, through factions selected as much for reliability as for ideology. For years, the flow had been cautious. Small arms, mortars, rocket launchers, enough to sustain resistance, but not enough to openly challenge Soviet dominance of the air. The problem was not will, it was risk. A modern, Western-manufactured surface-to-air missile carried consequences beyond Afghanistan. If captured, it could be reverse-engineered. If proliferated, it could threaten civilian aviation. If traced directly, it could collapse plausible deniability overnight. For much of the early 1980s, those risks outweighed the benefits. Instead, the Mujahideen relied on what they could scavenge or import indirectly. Heavy machine guns were mounted on trucks and hidden in orchards. Soviet aircraft adapted, flying higher and faster when possible. Older missiles, some dating back decades, were used sporadically, with mixed success. The air war remained tilted. By 1985, that imbalance had become the central obstacle to altering the conflict's trajectory. The Mujahideen could harass, they could ambush, they could endure, but they could not consistently stop helicopters from arriving where and when they were needed. This was the threshold moment. Inside policy circles, the question shifted from whether to introduce a decisive system to how to do it without losing control of the outcome. The weapon selected was compact, shoulder-fired, and built around a simple principle: heat. Unlike earlier systems that required complex guidance or large crews, this missile could be operated by a small team. Its seeker locked onto infrared signatures, engines, exhaust, the unavoidable warmth of machinery cutting through cold mountain air. The concept was not revolutionary in itself. What made it different was reliability. It worked consistently under field conditions. Training could be completed in weeks, not months. The missile did not require radar support. It did not announce its presence until launch, and once fired, its speed compressed reaction time to seconds. For pilots accustomed to evasive maneuvers against gunfire or older systems, this changed the geometry of survival. In late summer 1986, the first units were moved across the border. They did not arrive everywhere. They were not distributed equally. Access was tightly controlled. Operators were selected carefully. Ammunition was limited. Each missile was treated as an asset to be spent only when success was likely. This restraint mattered. The weapon's value was not just in what it destroyed, but in what it threatened. The first engagements were not publicized. There was no announcement, no declaration. Soviet units reported losses, but losses had occurred before. Helicopters went down for many reasons in Afghanistan. Weather, mechanical failure, heavy fire. At first, This looked like more of the same. Then patterns emerged. Aircraft hit outside known gun belts. Flares deployed too late. Evasive maneuvers that no longer worked. Pilots began reporting a new sound, a warning tone, a sensation of pursuit that did not break when they turned or dove. Commanders noticed that helicopters were being engaged during approach phases previously considered safe. Fixed-wing aircraft flying ground attack missions also became vulnerable during low-altitude passes. The war did not stop, but it slowed. Routes were reconsidered. Altitudes increased. Accuracy decreased. Missions were aborted more often. The psychological shift was immediate, even if the strategic implications took time to unfold. For Soviet forces, air power had never been about domination alone. It was about control, the ability to choose when and where contact occurred. The introduction of this missile did not remove that control instantly, but it fractured it. And once fractured, it could not be fully restored. The Mujahideen understood this quickly. They did not need to shoot down every aircraft. They needed to make every flight uncertain. The sky no longer belonged to one side. It became contested, moment by moment, launch by launch. By the autumn of 1986, that reality was filtering upward, from pilots to squadron commanders, from field reports to headquarters, from Afghanistan to Moscow. The war had not ended, but the terms under which it was fought had shifted. And to understand how profound that shift was, it helps to examine it from multiple perspectives: human, tactical, technological, and strategic, each revealing a different fault line opening beneath the conflict. For Soviet aircrews, Afghanistan had already been a war of nerves long before the new missile appeared. Flying a helicopter through Afghan valleys meant living inside a narrow envelope of risk. Too high, an engine strained in thin air. Too low, and ground fire clawed upward from unseen positions. Pilots learned routes by memory, by rock formations, river bends, the shadows that fell across slopes at certain hours of the day. Survival depended on familiarity. Crews flew the same corridors again and again, not because they were safe, but because they were known. Known danger could be managed, unknown danger could not. The arrival of the new missile shattered that psychological balance. The first change was subtle. Pilots stopped trusting routine. Approach paths that had been used for years suddenly felt exposed. Valleys once considered low risk now carried the possibility of an invisible threat waiting in silence. Even when nothing happened, tension accumulated. Then came the reports. A helicopter lost without warning. A gunship hit during what should have been a survivable maneuver. A crew gone before rescue teams could even reach the crash site. What unsettled pilots most was not the loss itself. It was the speed. There was no prolonged engagement, no chance to react fully, no clear moment when skill could overcome circumstance. A tone sounded, then the impact followed almost immediately. For aircrews trained to fight their way out of danger, this was something new. A weapon that reduced experience and bravery to marginal advantages. Morale began to fracture, not collapse, but erode. Pilots still flew. They had to. Units on the ground depended on them. Wounded soldiers needed evacuation. Outposts needed resupply. Orders still came, but the cockpit atmosphere changed. Flights became quieter. Checklists were followed with heightened intensity. Eyes scanned instruments and terrain with equal urgency. Crews watched flares burn out behind them and wondered whether they had been deployed too late. On the ground, Afghan civilians felt the shift from the opposite direction. For years, helicopters had been symbols of Soviet reach. Their arrival meant inspections, raids, or fighting. Their absence meant something else: uncertainty, but also opportunity. When aircraft began flying higher, faster, and less frequently, villages noticed. Helicopter landings grew rarer. Fire support became less precise. Some valleys saw days pass without rotor noise for the first time in years. The sky no longer carried the same inevitability. For fighters and civilians alike, that change mattered, not because it ended violence, but because it altered who felt watched, and who felt free to move. Under the same sky, both sides sensed that something fundamental had shifted, even if they could not yet measure it. Before the missile's arrival, Soviet air tactics were built around managing known threats. Heavy machine guns were dangerous within defined envelopes. Pilots learned to approach from angles that minimized exposure. Speed, altitude, and suppression fire worked together. If a helicopter stayed outside certain parameters, or broke them only briefly, the risk was acceptable. The new missile collapsed those parameters. Its effective engagement zone overlapped precisely with the altitude and speed ranges helicopters relied on for accuracy and control. Approaches that balance lift, visibility, and weapon effectiveness now passed directly through a kill envelope that could not be suppressed in advance. There was no muzzle flash to spot, no tracer arc to track, no crew serve team that could be neutralized before the landing. Instead, the threat existed as a possibility, anywhere, at any time. Tactically, this forced immediate adaptation. Helicopters climbed higher, approach angles steepened, landing times shortened, but these adjustments carried costs. Higher altitude meant reduced payloads. Troop numbers were cut. Fuel margins shrank. In hot conditions, some landing zones became unreachable altogether. Steeper descents increased mechanical stress and pilot workload. Fast insertions reduced coordination with ground units. Precision suffered. Fixed-wing aircraft faced similar dilemmas. Low-altitude attack runs, essential for accuracy against dispersed targets, became far more dangerous. Pilots either accepted higher risk or shifted to standoff munitions that lacked the same effect. Every tactical choice now involved a trade-off between exposure and effectiveness. The missile did not deny the airspace completely, it denied confidence. And in military operations, confidence is often the decisive factor. Ground commanders noticed the difference quickly. Requests for air support took longer to fulfill. Some were denied outright. Others arrived too late to shape engagements meaningfully. The war slowed, not in tempo, but in decisiveness. Operations that once relied on rapid vertical movement became more deliberate, more constrained. Units hesitated to insert forces into positions they might not be able to support or extract reliably. The geometry of the battlefield changed. What had been a three-dimensional problem, ground, air, and timing, flattened under new constraints. Control shrank. Flexibility narrowed. The missile's power lay not in destroying aircraft alone, but in compressing the range of viable choices available to those who depended on them. Technologically, the missile's impact was not about size or explosive force. It was about time. From seeker lock to impact, the window was brutally short. Pilots had seconds to recognize the threat, deploy countermeasures, maneuver, and hope. Earlier systems allowed more space. Warnings came sooner. Maneuvers had a chance to break tracking. Even if hit, damage might be survivable. This missile reduced all of that. Its seeker homed on heat, the one thing aircraft could not hide. Engines burned hot in cold mountain air, creating signatures that stood out clearly. Exhaust suppression helped, but it could not eliminate the problem entirely. Once launched, the missile did not need guidance from the operator. It followed its target autonomously. This freed the operator from exposure and reduced training complexity. The technology shifted the balance from crew coordination to individual opportunity. One person, one shot, a few seconds. That simplicity was its strength. It also meant the system scaled easily. Small teams could move quickly. Launch sites could change daily. Predicting where the next missile might appear became nearly impossible. Countermeasures existed, but they took time to deploy widely. Modifications to aircraft, new flight doctrines, improved flares. None of these were instantaneous solutions. Technology, once introduced, moved faster than adaptation, and while engineers worked to restore margins of safety, pilots continued flying in a space where those margins had already collapsed. By the end of 1986, it was clear that this was not just another incremental threat. It was a qualitative shift. A weapon dismissed by some as just another tube had compressed the air war into moments. Moments that determined whether a mission continued or ended in smoke and fire. And those moments were about to converge in a series of engagements that would define the turning point of the conflict. For Soviet leadership, the most dangerous consequence of the new missile was not immediate loss. It was recognition. Acknowledging vulnerability carried weight far beyond Afghanistan. Air power had long been a pillar of Soviet military doctrine, a symbol of technological parity with the West. To admit that a portable weapon could threaten that pillar meant confronting uncomfortable truths about adaptability, logistics, and the limits of centralized planning. At first, reports were treated cautiously. Aircraft had been lost before. Afghanistan was unforgiving. Pilots flew in harsh conditions, often at the edge of performance limits. Individual incidents could be explained away, but the pattern resisted dismissal. Losses clustered around approach phases. Countermeasures failed more often than expected. Survivors described a threat that behaved differently from anything previously encountered. Field commanders adjusted quickly. Flights were restricted. Altitude ceilings were raised. Some missions were postponed indefinitely. These decisions were pragmatic, but they also contradicted years of operational assumptions. Higher headquarters faced a dilemma. Adaptation meant accepting reduced effectiveness. Denial meant accepting rising losses. Neither option fit comfortably within existing doctrine. In Moscow, the conversation intersected with a broader reassessment already underway. By the mid-1980s, the war was no longer framed as a short-term intervention gone wrong. It was a persistent drain, economically, politically, and psychologically. The missile did not cause that realization. It sharpened it. Air commanders pushed for rapid countermeasures, better flares, infrared suppression, changes to engine exhaust systems. Engineers responded, but modifications took time. Aircraft had to be rotated out of theater. Crews needed retraining. Supply chains had to adjust. Meanwhile, the war continued under altered conditions. The leadership challenge was not just technical, it was institutional. Soviet systems excelled at planned modernization, not sudden improvisation under asymmetric pressure. Afghanistan demanded flexibility that the system struggled to provide. Each helicopter loss forced a calculation. Was the mission worth the risk? Each denied flight forced another. Could ground units hold without air support? Over time, these questions accumulated into something larger than tactics. They became strategic. The missile forced Soviet leadership to confront a reality that had been forming for years. That control of Afghanistan was contingent on an air advantage that could no longer be guaranteed. For the Mujahideen, the missile carried both power and responsibility. It was never plentiful. It was never universal. It was never meant to be. Distribution was tightly controlled. Not every group received access. Operators were selected, trained, and monitored. Ammunition was rationed. Each launch carried weight, not just in tactical terms, but political ones. A missed shot was not just a failure. It was a waste of leverage. This scarcity shaped how the weapon was used. Mujahideen teams avoided impulsive launches. They waited for favorable conditions. Clear lock, optimal range, minimal risk of counterfire. Patience became doctrine. When shots were taken, they were taken deliberately. The psychological impact of this restraint amplified the missile's reputation. Soviet pilots could not predict when or where it would appear. Silence became threatening. Valleys that produced no fire one day might erupt the next. Over time, stories spread. The missile became larger in legend than in reality. Some claimed it made helicopters obsolete. Others suggested it single-handedly forced Soviet withdrawal. These narratives traveled faster than facts, fueled by propaganda and the human need for decisive explanations. The truth was more complex. The missile did not end the air war. It constrained it. Helicopters still flew. Aircraft still struck targets. The Soviets adapted, reducing losses over time. Countermeasures improved. Flight profiles evolved, but the balance never fully returned. For the Mujahideen, the weapon's greatest value lay not in numbers destroyed, but in momentum gained. It validated years of resistance. It demonstrated that technology could level asymmetry, if introduced at the right moment, in the right way. It also carried risks. Proliferation worried even those who supplied it. Recovery efforts followed. Missiles were tracked, bought back, or disappeared into uncertain futures. The same portability that made the weapon effective also made it hard to control. In the Afghan context, however, those concerns were secondary. What mattered was that the sky no longer belonged exclusively to the enemy. That knowledge reshaped how the Mujahideen fought, how civilians endured, and how commanders on both sides planned their days. By late 1986, the weapon had moved beyond novelty. It had become a factor, one that would soon crystallize in a sequence of engagements that forced both sides to accept a new phase of the war. Those moments, compressed into seconds of flight and impact, marked the true turning point. The turning point did not arrive with a declaration. It arrived quietly, carried by routine. Late September 1986, eastern Afghanistan. The air corridors near Jalalabad were among the most heavily traveled in the region. Soviet helicopters used them to supply garrisons, rotate troops, and project presence along routes that ground convoys could not reliably secure. The terrain dictated behavior. Steep ridges, narrow valleys, limited landing zones. Pilots flew these routes repeatedly. Familiarity bred efficiency and vulnerability. On the ground, a small Mujahideen team waited. They had not chosen the day at random. Conditions mattered. Clear air, cold temperatures, predictable flight paths. The team had trained for weeks, rehearsing movements, identifying angles, learning restraint. They did not rush. When the helicopter appeared, it was doing what it always did, descending into the valley, engines burning hot against the cool mountain air. The approach profile was standard, shaped by years of experience and necessity. The operator raised the launcher. There was no dramatic exchange of fire, no warning shots, no build-up. A tone-confirmed lock. The launch was sudden, violent, and unmistakable. The missile climbed fast, leaving almost no time for reaction. Flares deployed, but too late. The seeker remained fixed. The distance closed in seconds. Impact followed. From the ground, witnesses saw a flash and smoke. From the air, there was barely time to register danger before control was lost. The helicopter broke apart as it fell, debris scattering across the valley floor. Rescue teams could not reach the site immediately. The area was contested. By the time recovery was possible, there was little left to recover. This was not the first aircraft lost in Afghanistan, but it was different. Within days, another helicopter was hit, then another. Fixed-wing aircraft conducting low-altitude strikes were engaged during attack runs. Losses clustered around phases previously considered manageable. Reports moved upward quickly. Pilots described the same sequence. Lock warning, launch, impact, too fast to evade reliably. Commanders compared notes. Patterns emerged. The threat was portable. It was precise. It appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. The reaction reaction was immediate. Flight restrictions were imposed. Altitude limits were raised across multiple sectors. Some missions were cancelled outright. Others were delayed until conditions were deemed safer, though safe had become a relative term. Ground units felt the effect almost immediately. Resupply schedules slipped. Medical evacuations took longer. Helicopter insertions were reduced or replaced with riskier ground movement. Units that had relied on rapid reinforcement now operated with thinner margins. Morale shifted, not collapsed. Shifted. Pilots still flew, but the confidence that had underpinned operations eroded. Every approach carried new calculations. Every descent was weighed against the possibility that somewhere below, someone was waiting with a weapon that could not be suppressed in advance. The psychological impact spread faster than the physical one. Even when flights were not engaged, crews reported heightened stress. The absence of fire no longer meant safety. It meant uncertainty. On the Mujahideen side, the effect was equally pronounced. Success validated patience. Teams that had waited weeks for a single opportunity saw results. The weapon's reputation grew with each confirmed hit. Fighters who had endured years of air dominance now saw proof that it could be challenged. But discipline remained crucial. The missile was not fired at every opportunity. Targets were selected carefully. Engagements favored approach and departure phases, when aircraft were most vulnerable and countermeasures least effective. Each successful launch reinforced doctrine. By early October, the change was undeniable. Soviet air operations continued, but under constraint. The sky was no longer permissive. It was contested, moment by moment. Higher headquarters began requesting accelerated countermeasures. Engineers rushed solutions forward. Additional flares were shipped. Infrared suppression systems were prioritized. Training manuals were updated, but none of these changes could erase what had already occurred. The psychological threshold had been crossed. A weapon once dismissed as just another tube had proven capable of altering the rhythm of an entire campaign. It did not end the war. It did not destroy Soviet air power, but it forced a recalibration that would echo through every operation that followed. And as countermeasures rolled out and tactics evolved, the war entered a new phase, one defined not by dominance, but by adaptation under pressure. Adaptation began immediately, but it did not restore what had been lost. Soviet engineers and commanders moved with urgency. Aircraft were fitted with additional flare dispensers. Flight crews were retrained to deploy countermeasures earlier and more aggressively. Engines were modified where possible to reduce infrared signatures. New approach patterns were tested, favoring altitude over precision. On paper, these changes looked decisive. In practice, they came with trade-offs that reshaped the battlefield. Flares burned bright, but they did not guarantee survival. Against the seeker designed to discriminate targets, decoys bought time, but only if deployed perfectly. Pilots now had to assume that every warning tone could be fatal, and that hesitation was a liability. Higher altitude flight reduced exposure, but it also reduced effectiveness. Helicopters could not insert troops into confined landing zones as easily. Fixed-wing aircraft lost accuracy against dispersed targets. Close air support became less close, more generalized. The air war shifted from control to risk management. This transition unfolded unevenly. Some sectors adapted faster than others. Some crews became adept at new profiles. Loss rates declined from the initial shock, but they never returned to previous baselines. The knowledge that the threat remained, even when unseen, changed behavior permanently. Ground commanders adjusted accordingly. Operations were planned with reduced reliance on rapid air mobility. Patrols were extended. Outposts were consolidated or abandoned. Supply schedules were redesigned to minimize exposure, even if that meant accepting shortages or delays. The war became heavier. Where helicopters had once carried the burden of movement, now soldiers carried it themselves, along mountain trails, through valleys where time replaced speed as the decisive factor. For the Mujahideen, this phase was marked by both success and limitation. The missile had proven its value, but it did not multiply. Stocks remained finite. Launch teams were rotated carefully. Each engagement was weighed against the risk of exposure and counterattack. Soviet forces did not stop hunting launch teams. Artillery and air strikes followed suspected firing positions. Villages associated with missile use came under increased scrutiny. The cost of success rose alongside its impact. This dynamic prevented the missile from becoming a blunt instrument. It remained a scalpel. Strategically, its effect was cumulative. Soviet commanders now faced a battlefield where every advantage came with caveats. Air superiority existed, but it was conditional. Mobility existed, but it was constrained. Firepower existed, but it was less precise. Over months, these constraints fed into broader assessments already underway in Moscow. The war was not lost because of this missile, but it became harder to justify. Each adaptation required resources. Each loss carried political weight. Each restriction reduced the effectiveness of forces already stretched thin. The missile did not create the decision to withdraw. That decision had roots in economics, politics, and public fatigue. But it sharpened the calculus. It removed the illusion that technological superiority alone could solve the problem. By late 1987, Soviet air operations bore little resemblance to those of the early years. The sky was busier with flares. Aircraft flew higher. Missions were shorter. Exposure windows were minimized. The war continued, but under constraints that favored the defender. In that sense, the turning point was not a single engagement or statistic. It was a realization. The realization that a small, portable weapon could compress advantage into vulnerability. That control of the air, once taken for granted, could be contested by individuals with limited resources and precise timing. As the conflict moved toward its final years, this reality shaped every decision, every sortie, every calculation of cost versus gain. And when the withdrawal finally began, it did so under skies that were quieter but no less dangerous. The consequences of that shift did not end with the last Soviet convoy. They carried forward into arsenals, doctrines, and memories far beyond Afghanistan. The immediate aftermath of the missile's arrival was not measured in headlines, but in adjustments. Soviet air operations did not cease. Helicopters still lifted off. Aircraft still crossed valleys and ridgelines. But the tempo changed in ways that were felt across the theater. Flights became shorter. Routes became less predictable. Mission planners built redundancy where none had existed before. For units on the ground, this translated into a different kind of war. Resupply became intermittent. Ammunition and food still arrived, but schedules slipped. Medical evacuations were prioritized. Yet even these carried delays as aircraft waited for safer conditions or flew longer routes to minimize exposure. Some isolated positions were reassessed entirely. Outposts that had been sustained primarily by air were consolidated or abandoned. Terrain that had been held through mobility was relinquished in favor of defensible ground closer to reliable supply lines. This was not collapse. It was contraction. The Mujahideen felt the shift in momentum quickly. The missile became a symbol, not just of tactical success, but of strategic possibility. Recruitment benefited from visible proof that the war could still be shaped. Fighters who had spent years avoiding the sky now looked upward with a sense of leverage. But the reality on the ground remained complex. The missile did not make every valley safe. It did not prevent all airstrikes. It did not guarantee victory in engagements. Soviet forces adapted. Losses declined from their initial spike as countermeasures improved and tactics evolved. What remained was pressure. Every aircraft that flew carried an added cost, not always in losses, but in limitations. Precision suffered, surprise diminished, flexibility narrowed. This pressure extended beyond the battlefield. Propaganda value amplified the missile's impact. Images of downed helicopters circulated widely. Narratives hardened around the idea that Soviet air power had been defeated, even when the reality was more restrained. These narratives mattered. They influenced foreign support. They shaped diplomatic perceptions. They fed into a growing sense that the war had crossed a point of diminishing returns. Inside the Soviet Union, the conflict was already unpopular. Casualties, though modest by conventional war standards, accumulated year after year. Economic strain was visible. The rationale for continued sacrifice grew thinner. The missile did not introduce these problems. It sharpened them. Each aircraft lost now carried symbolic weight beyond its tactical value. Each adjustment reinforced the sense that the war was consuming resources without delivering decisive results. For the Afghan government forces aligned with Moscow, the effect was mixed. Reduced Soviet air presence in some regions created space, but also vulnerability. Afghan units depended even more heavily on Soviet support as conditions grew harder. The battlefield became fragmented. Some regions stabilized under revised tactics. Others slipped further from control as mobility declined. The war grew more uneven, less predictable. By the late 1980s, assessments began to converge. The conflict could be sustained, it could be managed, but it could not be resolved on favorable terms. The missile had not delivered a knockout blow. It had delivered something more corrosive, a sustained challenge to the assumption of superiority. That assumption had underpinned the intervention from the start. Without it, every justification had to be revisited. As discussions of withdrawal gained momentum, the lessons of the air war weighed heavily. Planners did not point to a single weapon or battle. They pointed to trends, constraints, costs, and a shrinking margin for error. The war's end, when it came, would be framed as a political decision, but the battlefield had already shaped that decision quietly, day by day, flight by flight. And as Soviet forces prepared to leave, another set of consequences began to take shape, ones that extended far beyond Afghanistan itself. The end of the Soviet-Afghan war did not close the story of the missile. It opened another. As withdrawal plans moved forward and Soviet forces began their staged exit in 1988, attention shifted to what remained behind, not just in Afghanistan but in the global security landscape. Among the most sensitive concerns was proliferation. The same qualities that made the missile effective in Afghanistan made it dangerous elsewhere. It was portable. It was reliable. It required minimal infrastructure. These traits raised alarms far beyond the battlefield. Efforts were made to recover and used missiles. Programs were established to buy them back. Intelligence services tracked serial numbers, movements, and rumors of sales. Some missiles were accounted for, others were not. The uncertainty mattered. Portable air defense systems represented a long-term risk to civilian aviation and military operations alike. The Afghan experience demonstrated how easily such weapons could alter airspace control, even in the hands of irregular forces. In doctrinal terms, the impact was immediate and lasting. Militaries around the world re-examined assumptions about air superiority. Countermeasures once considered secondary became standard. Aircraft design increasingly accounted for infrared suppression, redundancy, and survivability against shoulder-fired threats. Flight doctrines changed. Low-altitude operations were reconsidered. Helicopter tactics emphasized unpredictability and standoff. Training stressed rapid threat recognition and response under compressed timelines. The lessons learned in Afghan valleys migrated into manuals, simulations, and procurement decisions. Politically, the narrative hardened. The missile was often cited as the weapon that won the war. This interpretation simplified a far more complex reality. The Soviet withdrawal resulted from intersecting pressures: economic stagnation, political reform, international isolation, and an unwinnable counterinsurgency. But symbols endure longer than explanations. The image of a small missile bringing down a powerful aircraft fit the moment. It aligned with broader Cold War narratives of asymmetry and resistance. It resonated in a world already inclined to view superpower intervention with skepticism. For Afghanistan itself, the aftermath was harsher. The war did not end with withdrawal. It transformed. Weapons introduced during the conflict remained in circulation. Factions rearmed and repositioned. The air war faded, but violence did not. The missile's legacy inside Afghanistan was therefore ambivalent. It had constrained one adversary. It had empowered certain groups, but it had not built stability. In some cases, it deepened fragmentation by amplifying the power of those who controlled access to advanced weapons. In others, it became part of a broader militarization that outlived its original purpose. Globally, however, the lesson was unmistakable. Technological advantage was no longer absolute. Control of the air was conditional. Asymmetry could be engineered. This understanding shaped conflicts well beyond the Cold War's end. From counterinsurgency planning to aviation security, the Afghan example lingered as a cautionary case. A single system, introduced at the right moment, could compress years of operational certainty into uncertainty. As the last Soviet troops crossed back over the border, the mountains they left behind were quiet but not empty. Wreckage still marked valleys. Flight paths still traced invisible lines through the sky. And somewhere in that silence was the residue of a realization that would shape military thinking for decades to come. To understand what that realization truly meant, beyond tactics and technology, it is necessary to step back and reflect on what this episode revealed about power, perception, and the limits of force. In the end, the missile was never just a weapon. It was a question aimed at assumptions that had governed modern warfare since the middle of the 20th century. Assumptions about dominance, about technology, about the permanence of advantage once achieved. For years, the Soviet air campaign in Afghanistan represented control. Helicopters moved troops where roads could not go. Aircraft arrived when and where they were needed. The sky was a solution to geography. Then a small, portable system reduced that solution to a conditional privilege, not through overwhelming firepower, not through numbers, but through timing. Seconds mattered. Seconds in which a pilot had to recognize a tone, deploy countermeasures, maneuver, and hope. Seconds in which preparation, training, and experience narrowed to a margin that could not always save them. This compression of advantage revealed something enduring about asymmetric conflict. Power does not vanish all at once. It erodes. It erodes when certainty becomes doubt, when freedom of action becomes calculation, when dominance must ask permission of risk. The missile did not defeat a superpower. It did not dictate policy on its own. It did not end the war, but it exposed a boundary beyond which technology alone could not guarantee outcomes in terrain shaped by people, patience, and persistence. That lesson echoed long after the last Soviet convoy crossed the border. It reshaped how air forces trained, how helicopters were designed, how planners assessed threats once dismissed as marginal. It also left a more sobering reminder. Weapons introduced to solve immediate problems do not remain confined to their moment. They travel, they persist, they reshape futures in ways no single battlefield can contain. In Afghanistan, A tool once dismissed as insignificant proved capable of altering a war, not by destroying everything in seconds, but by making every second matter. And in that realization lies the quiet power of the episode. Not in the wreckage on valley floors, not in the myths that follow, but in the understanding that control, once assumed, must always be defended, and that even the smallest instruments can force the largest systems to change. The sky, after all, remembers.